Mr. Callahan, they're digging on your property, and they just pulled out a skull.
David didn't need details. He was in his truck within 60 seconds. The phone still pressed to his ear. 15 minutes later, he stood at the edge of 14 acres of verified Civil War campsite, now scraped and dug by a dozen volunteers. Susan Prescott, the HOA's Common Gardens chair, directed the chaos. Already, they had pulled a flag fragment, 2 muskets, and a brass buckle from the dirt. Then a shovel struck something harder. A volunteer pulled away dirt to reveal a human skull, still wearing a Confederate cap. Susan barely glanced at it. She pointed to the trash pile.
That's not part of the garden plan. Throw it in with the rest of the junk.
David arrived just as a volunteer was bagging the remains.
That's a soldier, Susan. You just desecrated a federal archaeological site.
Without another word, David pulled out his phone and dialed the National Park Service. The battle for Pendleton's Crossing had just begun. But David had seen it coming. He was a battlefield archaeologist, and his 14 acres were a verified Confederate camp. Inside his study, a worn journal from his great-great-grandfather told of the bloody stand at Pendleton's Crossing. For 10 years, he had documented every artifact, pushing for National Historic Landmark status. Approval was weeks away.
It's just an overgrown field. We're putting in a community garden. Stop being dramatic.
That field is a Civil War camp. There are likely soldiers buried there. Digging is a federal crime.
Susan's smile stayed sharp. She claimed the HOA map proved the corner was common land, and she had the votes.
HOA records say otherwise. Nobody cares about old buttons. The dig is next week.
That night, David spread his evidence across the table. Deeds, surveys, and the federal preservation tag for his ancestors' buckle. He had warned them. Now, barely 24 hours later, a shovel had struck a skull, and Susan's volunteers were bagging bones like garbage. The National Park Service was on its way, and David had the documentation to prove exactly what they had desecrated. Earlier that morning, Susan Prescott had assembled her team with a single goal: transform this patch of dirt into a vegetable garden.
We're doing something good here. Fresh produce for the community. Just ignore any old metal or glass you find.
A volunteer named Kim Yi shifted uneasily. She'd heard rumors about this land, but Susan's confidence was contagious. Within minutes, a shovel clinked. A volunteer held up a brass buckle stamped 1862.
Toss it. Probably from a cow or something.
Then, more objects surfaced. Buttons, a bayonet, the barrel of a musket. Susan waved them off as rusty trash.
Susan, these are military items. This could be a battlefield.
Don't be dramatic. We have permission from the HOA. Now keep working.
Then Kim's shovel struck something solid. She dropped to her knees and dug with her hands, uncovering a human skull and a Confederate cap. Susan barely looked. She pointed toward the trash pile. Just bones. Throw it in the pile. Susan shouted for David to leave, claiming he was trespassing on HOA common ground. He didn't move.
I have the county deed, the original survey, and 40 years of tax receipts. This is my land. You are the trespasser.
Your papers mean nothing. The HOA board approved this garden. The police will escort you out.
But when local officer Harris arrived, he took one look at the skull on the tarp and the musket in the dirt and shook his head.
This is a federal matter now. I've got no jurisdiction over archaeological remains. National Park Service is on their way.
Within the hour, 2 NPS Rangers pulled up in a white SUV, followed by a federal agent carrying a crime scene kit.
Everyone step back. This site is now under federal protection. Nobody leaves with so much as a button.
Agent Reyes strung yellow tape around the entire dig area and started cataloging every artifact, including the skull Susan had ordered thrown away.
We've got a cleanup in aisle 5. The landowner is David Callahan. The HOA just made a very expensive mistake.
Susan stood behind the tape, her face pale. The Park Service wasn't asking permission, and the battle for Pendleton's Crossing was no longer just David's fight. Over the next few hours, The forensic team extracted the remains and cataloged artifacts. Then, Agent Reyes made a phone call that changed everything.
Get me a tribal liaison. We've got remains here that aren't just Confederate. There's a second set of bones, and the artifacts suggest Cherokee.
David explained that his ancestors' journal mentioned a Cherokee scout at Pendleton's Crossing. He handed over the leather-bound volume.
Private Jonah Littlejohn, also known as Sequoia's nephew. He was buried with his regimental buckle and a Cherokee amulet.
Agent Reyes studied the journal, then the belt buckle David had been carrying. The pieces matched.
Under NAGPRA, disturbing native remains triggers mandatory federal involvement. The entire site is now a potential National Register property.
Reyes spread out David's map overlay. The battlefield boundary covered 600 acres, including the clubhouse and dozens of homes.
I am recommending emergency preservation under 16 U.S.C. 470. This whole subdivision may become federal land.
Susan, still behind the tape, heard the words federal land, and her composure cracked. The Park Service wasn't just investigating a crime. They were preparing to erase the HOA's authority, over 600 acres, starting with the very ground beneath Susan's feet. Within 48 hours, a formal notice arrived at the HOA office, citing 16 U.S.C. Section 470 and ordering an emergency preservation assessment.
They can't do this. Not to me. It's just a garden.
She called every attorney she knew until she landed on Elliot Shaw, a developer's bulldog who specialized in burying nuisance claims.
Don't worry, Susan. I'll tie this up in procedural motions for years. Federal overreach is a gold mine in court.
But when the community meeting was called, the room wasn't full of allies. It was full of neighbors who just learned their homes sat on a battlefield.
Susan, this man warned you. You went ahead and dug up a grave. Now my property value is a footnote in a federal seizure.
I pulled a skull out of the ground, Susan, a real skull. You told me it was trash. I can't sleep.
Elliot, say something.
Let's not panic. We'll challenge the federal designation on constitutional grounds. But, Susan, the evidence is extensive.
By the end of the night, Susan sat alone at the podium. The community had abandoned her, and even her lawyer looked sick. The federal machine was already in gear. 3 days later, the National Park Service filed its emergency motion. Judge Patricia Holloway scheduled an immediate hearing in Denver.
Your Honor, this 1862 buckle was ripped from a soldier's grave and tossed in the trash by order of the defendant. The skull of a Cherokee scout was bagged like garbage. This is not a property dispute. It is a desecration of a national treasure.
I warned the HOA multiple times. Susan called me dramatic. Then I watched her order a volunteer to bag human remains as junk.
The HOA had no criminal intent. They believed they were on common ground. This was a misunderstanding, not a federal case.
Counselor, are you arguing that ordering volunteers to throw a human skull in the trash was a simple misunderstanding?
The situation was chaotic. My client made a mistake in the heat of the moment.
Mistake? The law does not grade degrees of desecration. I believe I've heard enough for now.
Susan's manicured hands clutched the table. The judge's tone told her everything. Behind the clerk's bench, a draft order was being typed. Outside the courtroom, David knew the next piece of paper would redraw 600 acres. Susan Prescott's HOA was about to be erased. Inside her chambers, Judge Holloway signed the emergency preservation order. 600 acres including the clubhouse, golf course, and 28 homes, federalized effective immediately. Elliot Shaw read the order aloud in his office, his voice unsteady.
The court finds the HOA's actions an emergency threat to irreplaceable resources. All lands within the battlefield boundary are seized under eminent domain at pre-violation assessed value.
Pre-violation value? That's pennies. We're ruined.
Susan grabbed the paper from his hands. The words blurred, but the red boundary on the map showed everything she'd built. Gone. By evening, certified letters arrived at every home within the boundary. Residents opened their doors to find official notices. Your property is now under federal management. The HOA clubhouse, manicured fairways, The pool and tennis courts all belonged to the United States. Susan sat in her car outside the clubhouse, staring at the sign that still read Ridgehaven Estates. Her empire had been erased with a single signature. The HOA was effectively dissolved by court order. There would be no appeal, no delay. And in the middle of that red boundary, Susan Prescott's reign was over. At dawn the next morning, a convoy of NPS vehicles rolled through Ridgehaven Estates. Rangers in green uniforms unloaded stacks of metal signs. Susan saw them from her car and stumbled out, still in yesterday's blazer, her eyes wild.
You can't. That's private property. I'll sue every one of you for trespassing.
A ranger ignored her scream, drilling the sign deep into the clubhouse wood.
They're actually doing it. They're stealing my clubhouse. The community garden. It's all gone.
Officer Harris pulled up and handed a clipboard to Ranger Jennings. Local jurisdiction over the entire 600 acres ended with a single signature.
Ranger Jennings. The county is formally surrendering all security duties to the National Park Service. This area is now federal land.
David watched from across the street, his ancestor's brass buckle heavy in his hand. The battlefield was finally protected. The HOA logo on the clubhouse wall was covered with a metallic federal plaque. Pendleton's Crossing National Battlefield Site. Emergency preservation.
No? This is my life. My work. You can't just take it.
As Susan's scream died, Agent Reyes moved through the crowd of rangers. In her hand was a federal arrest warrant, freshly signed.
Susan Prescott, you are under arrest for felony violations of ARPA, Anagbron, and NAGPRA. Turn around and place your hands behind your back.
They're arresting me? Over a garden? This is absurd.
Susan's mouth opened, but no sound came. Her coral blazer felt like a straitjacket. Reyes took Susan's wrists, her grip firm. The handcuffs ratcheted shut with a final click. The charges: destruction of archaeological resources, disturbance of human remains, and willful desecration of a National Register-eligible site. David stood 50 feet away, the brass buckle still clutched in his hand. He watched without satisfaction.
This was never revenge. It was preservation.
Ranger Jennings bagged Susan's coral blazer as evidence, the bright fabric disappearing into a clear plastic bag with a federal evidence tag attached. The federal case was no longer about property. It was now about prison. Susan's battle had just entered its darkest chapter. Within a week, a federal grand jury convened in Denver to hear the case against Susan Prescott. David was the first witness. He carried his ancestor's journal and the brass buckle to the stand.
That land is a verified Confederate camp. I had filed for National Historic Landmark status. I warned them repeatedly.
He described watching Susan order a volunteer to throw the human remains in the trash.
Did the defendant ever admit the site was archaeologically significant?
She called the buttons junk and the skull just bones. She knew exactly what she was destroying.
Then a tribal historian testified about the Cherokee Scout. Disturbing those bones was not just a crime, it was a desecration. Photographs of the skull in the trash bag were passed among the jurors. The room fell silent. After 2 days of testimony, the grand jury returned a true bill on all 3 felony charges. Susan's lawyer was granted only a brief meeting. The weight of federal evidence left little room for hope. 2 days later, Susan Prescott entered the federal courtroom in a plain suit, Elliot Shaw stiff at her side. Every eye was on her.
How do you plead to the felony charges under ARPA and NAGPRA and NAGPRA?
Not guilty.
The prosecutor didn't flinch. She laid out the case, taped confessions, the trash bag photos, David's journal, matching the very amulet found on the Cherokee Scout.
I am scheduling trial for 60 days from now. Discovery will be expedited. Mr. Shaw, I trust you are prepared.
In a sterile meeting room down the hall, Elliot Shaw closed the door and loosened his tie. Susan slumped into a chair, her face blank.
Susan, the evidence is overwhelming. The best I can do is negotiate a plea. You'd face 6 months federal prison, lifetime banned from federal sites.
6 months in a cell. and I'd never be allowed within a mile of my old clubhouse. It's a life sentence.
It's that or risk 20 years. The AUSA won't offer this again after the hearing. I need an answer.
Susan's lips moved, but no word came out. The deal hung in the air, a thin branch over an abyss. She still had a choice to make. 3 days before trial, Elliot Shaw filed a desperate motion to suppress every artifact, arguing the seizure was unconstitutional. Judge Holloway held an emergency hearing. The AUSA stood rigid, a box of evidence bags on the table between them.
Your Honor, the emergency order was overbroad. These artifacts were seized without proper warrant or due process.
The order was valid. ARPA authorizes immediate preservation. She had no reasonable expectation of privacy in a crime scene.
Motion to suppress denied. The artifacts remains and all documentation are admitted, and the federalization stands. This court will not issue a stay.
Susan gripped the edge of her chair. The last legal shield was gone. All the evidence she'd dismissed would now be paraded before a jury.
I told you, there's no wiggle room. The suppression was our only shot. Now it's trial or the deal.
The prosecutor slid a document across the table. The formal plea offer, unchanged. 6 months, lifetime ban, $10,000 fine.
That's it then, no more battles. If I go to trial, I'll lose everything. The deal is my only way out.
The courtroom emptied. Susan sat alone at the defense table. The plea document before her, a pen beside it. She hadn't yet picked it up, while Susan sat alone with her choice. David retreated to the one place he still felt whole, his study, surrounded by history. He opened his great-great-grandfather's journal to the entry marked the 3rd of July, 1862.
The ground shook with cannon fire. We fell back through the creek, the Cherokee scout at my side, his eyes on the tree line.
The next line mentioned Private Jonah Littlejohn by name, the scout whose bones Susan had thrown away.
They were more than bones. They were men who walked these fields, bled here, and deserved better.
He closed the journal and walked out to the edge of his property, the brass buckle warm in his palm. The federal signs were already weathering on the posts. The house across the field, once Susan's, now sat empty under a new lease agreement. He looked out over the 600 acres, now a legitimate battlefield protection site. His ancestors' legacy had won.
Soon this will be a place of remembrance, not a subdivision. The soldiers will have their due.
Plans for the Pendleton's Crossing National Battlefield Park were already being drafted. David would be its first superintendent. The courtroom had emptied hours ago, but Susan Prescott still sat alone at the defense table. The plea document in front of her, her hand finally moved. She took the pen, the weight of everything she'd lost, pulling the nib toward the paper.
6 months in a cell, and I'll never set foot on federal land again. That includes my own clubhouse.
She called for her lawyer. Elliot Shaw appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, face grim.
I assume you've reached a decision.
I'll sign. No more fighting. Just get me out of here.
In the conference room, Elliot spread the final agreement. The terms were stark. 6 months federal prison, 2 years supervised release, a permanent ban from all federally listed sites, and a $10,000 fine. Susan's hand was steady this time. She signed her name at the bottom, and with that stroke, her life as she knew it ended. The next morning, Susan stood before Judge Holloway, her attorney at her side, to change her plea. "How do you plead?" the judge asked. Susan's voice cracked. "Guilty, Your Honor." The plea was accepted, and sentencing set for 30 days later. She was let out, her freedom gone. 30 days later, the sentencing hearing filled the courtroom. David sat in the front row, the brass buckle heavy in his pocket.
I didn't just lose property. I watched men who died for a cause be thrown away like garbage. That stain doesn't wash out.
The defendant's actions were deliberate and callous. The recommended sentence is both just and restrained.
Your Honor, my client has accepted responsibility. She asks only that the court consider her otherwise unblemished record.
Mrs. Prescott, you desecrated hallowed ground. This court sentences you to 6 months federal prison. 2 years supervised release, a permanent ban from all federally listed sites, and a $10,000 fine.
Susan's face crumpled. Her coral blazer was long gone, replaced by a dull gray dress that matched her future.
6 months. I'll never see my clubhouse, my garden, my life again. It's over.
Judge Holloway struck her gavel. The sound echoed like a final shot as Susan was led away in cuffs. David felt no joy, only the quiet knowledge that the dead would finally be remembered.
It's over. The park will stand and they'll be remembered. Justice, finally.
2 weeks after the sentencing, workers removed the Ridgehaven Estates sign from the stone pillar and replaced it with a new plaque, Pendleton's Crossing National Battlefield Park. The clubhouse doors opened not for HOA meetings, but for visitors. Inside, Ranger Jennings oversaw the transformation into a museum and welcome center.
This hall once echoed with arguments over garden plots. Now it will tell the story of men who died here.
At the official dedication, David Callahan, now Superintendent Callahan, cut a red ribbon stretched across the park entrance.
My great-great-grandfather wrote about this ground. Today it belongs to everyone.
Henry McCabe, who had once accused Susan at the community meeting, stepped forward to shake David's hand.
You gave us a park instead of a prison. We won't forget it.
Nearby, Kim Yee helped hang an interpretive panel about the Cherokee Scout, her guilt slowly replaced by purpose. The HOA was formally dissolved by federal order that same day. Its records were boxed and archived, its authority a memory. For the first time, the land was not a subdivision. It was a battlefield, preserved forever. On the first official day, the parking lot overflowed. Families, historians, and former HOA residents walked the newly paved paths. At center stage, Superintendent David Callahan stood with the 1862 buckle pinned to his uniform.
This park exists because a community garden uncovered a cemetery. What was lost is now found.
Former HOA residents now stood as lessees. Henry McCabe held his federal lease, nodding. Children touched the restored cannon. Volunteers in period uniform answered their questions. Families walked the battlefield trail, reading interpretive signs about the battle and the Cherokee Scout. Inside the museum, the brass belt buckle and the regimental flag fragment rested under glass, listed as artifacts recovered from the Susan Prescott incident. A small card beside them read, "Preserved by Superintendent David Callahan, descendant of a Pendleton's Crossing survivor." Kim Yee pointed toward the Cherokee Scout display. "I found him in the dirt," she said quietly. "Now he has a home." The sun set on Pendleton's Crossing. The park had opened, the dead were honored, and the community, once fractured, had found common ground. 100 miles away, Susan Prescott sat in her federal prison cell, the orange jumpsuit a world removed from the coral blazer she once wore. She stared out the small window, but the view wasn't of her clubhouse. It was a slice of the battlefield park, the sign just visible in the distance.
I just wanted a garden. Now they have a whole battlefield, and I have nothing.
That same afternoon, David Callahan walked the hushed corridor of the museum, his footsteps quiet on the polished floor. He stopped before the glass case that held his ancestor's belt buckle, now a federal artifact. The red Federal Preservation tag still dangled from the buckle, the same one he had carried that first day.
She wanted to erase history. Instead, she gave it a place where millions will learn.
A guide led a group of students past, pointing to the Cherokee Scout display. David smiled faintly. Back in her cell, Susan traced the lines of a plastic chair. The ban from federal sites was permanent, a life sentence without bars. The park was the living irony. Born from a crime, now a monument to the very sacrifice Susan had dismissed as junk. On the former golf course, families spread picnic blankets where putting greens once rolled. NPS Rangers on horseback rode the perimeter trails, their silhouettes against the blue sky a symbol of permanence. Superintendent David Callahan led a group of visitors along a wooded path, pointing out where the Confederates fell back through the creek.
Right here, Private Littlejohn stood his ground. His bones are now at peace.
In the visitor center, a young boy pressed his face to the glass case, staring at the brass buckle as his father read the story aloud. Henry McCabe knelt in a small garden behind his leased home, planting heirloom tomatoes. The soil, he liked to say, had seen worse.
Told you I'd get my garden one way or another.
The entrance sign of Pendleton's Crossing National Battlefield Park stood polished under the high sun, cars filling the lot as families arrived. On the battlefield trail, children traced the lines of rifle pits with their fingers, their laughter echoing where cannons once roared. The park was no longer a subdivision. It was a place where history lived, where the dead had names, and where David Callahan walked the fields his ancestor once crossed. Dusk painted the battlefield in gold and shadow. David walked alone, the last visitor long gone. He followed the trail to a small stone marker, newly set, PVT, Jonah Littlejohn, Cherokee Scout, 1862. David knelt, removing the brass buckle from his pocket. The red federal tag fluttered in the breeze. He set the buckle gently on the stone, a gift returned to the man who had carried it into battle. No words were needed. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind where cannons once roared.
Rest now, Private. This land is yours.
Above him, the first stars appeared. The park lay quiet, alive and at peace. He stood, the weight of years gone from his shoulders, and as he walked back toward the visitor center, the brass buckle remained on the stone, a small monument to what had been saved. The battle for Pendleton's Crossing was finally over. The sun set, and the brass buckle on Private Littlejohn's grave caught the last light. The red federal tag fluttered in the evening breeze, a quiet sentinel. Slowly, the view expanded to the vast battlefield, restored and peaceful. Where once a golf course lay, now trenches and trails told the story. Pendleton's Crossing National Battlefield Park, established 2024, had erased a subdivision. The bones were at peace, honored in the soil they died for. In a federal cell, Susan Prescott traced a park brochure, the closest she would get. The brass buckle stayed on the stone, a monument to what began with a shovel. At dawn, children would run where soldiers fell, their laughter the best memorial. The battle for Pendleton's Crossing was over, but the story would live forever.